Ready as well.
Great. It looks like everyone's here then, and so we can officially go on the record. Just for the record, today is Tuesday, 20th. Yesterday, Monday, April 19th, we had some issues with our virtual trial platform, Cisco WebEx. I will say that this was not a problem on the AOC side of things. The issue was with Cisco WebEx. And so they had some issues that needed to be fixed. Late yesterday afternoon, those issues were fixed and we were able to get the matter resolved. But I apologize for the delay yesterday and hope that things go better this morning. I think they will. This is the second week of this case, and I will go ahead and say this is Wake County file number 18 CBS 15292, Jabari Holmes and others versus Timothy Moore and others. We are still in the plaintiff's case in chief. I know that on Friday we dropped off with Professor Ariel White, and I know that she was not able to be here yesterday, and so Ms. Riggs, I don't know whether she is able to be here today or whether you have another witness lined up, but I'll let you address that.
We do have another two witnesses lined up today, and Dr. White will return tomorrow.
Okay, who's the first witness that will be calling this morning?
Representative Tracy Harrison.
Okay, who will be examining that witness on behalf of the plaintiff?
My colleague, Ms. Klein.
Okay, her first name is Hillary Klein.
Yes, sir.
Yes, Your Honor. Good morning.
Good morning, Ms. Klein. How about for the legislative defendant?
Your Honor, the cross-examination will be handled by Joseph Masterman.
Good morning, Your Honors.
Good morning. Is that Mr. Masterman?
Yes, this is Miss Joe Masterman, M-A-S-T-E-R-M. Thanks, Your Honor.
Okay, great. Thank you. And for the state defendant?
That would be Paul Cox, Your Honor.
All right, Mr. Cox. Are there any other matters that we need to take up prior to allowing the plaintiff to call their next witness?
None for the plaintiffs, Your Honor.
And none for the legislative defendants, Your Honor.
Remind me where we were with Professor White's testimony on Friday when we stopped. Was it David Giller still asking her questions on direct?
No, Your Honor. I was still, this is David Thompson. I was still asking questions on cross-examination, and I have a little bit more to go.
Okay, fair enough. Thank you for that. All right, Ms. Klein, you may call the plaintiff's next witness then.
Thank you, Your Honor. Plaintiffs call Representative Tracy Harrison.
Okay, we can let Mr. Harrison into the virtual courtroom here. Can Pricey Harrison hear me?
Yes. Sorry.
It's okay. I can hear a person saying yes, but could you identify yourself, please?
Sorry, this is Tracy Harrison.
All right. Ms. Harrison, welcome to the courtroom. Are you ready to testify in this case?
Yes, sir, I am.
All right. If you would please then, I see you sort of trying to get some audio things hooked up there. Let me let you go ahead and do that, and then you tell me when you're ready.
I'm sorry, I am ready now. Thank you.
That's fine. If you would please raise your right hand. Ms. Beal, if you could please swear in the witness.
Yes, sir. Do you solemnly affirm that your testimony to the court will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, and this is your solemn affirmation?
I do.
Thank you. You can lower your hand.
Ms. Klein, you may proceed.
Thank you, Your Honor, and may it please the court. Representative Harrison, thank you for being here today. We've met, but for the record, my name is Hillary Klein. I represent plaintiffs in this matter. Could you please introduce yourself to the court?
Hi, I'm Tracy Harrison. I represent House District 61 in North Carolina House of Representatives.
Can you describe the geographic area of House District 61, please?
So it's in Guilford County, and it's primarily Greensboro. And I've served since I was first elected in 2004. I've served since 2005.
So about how many years have you served in the General Assembly?
I am in my 17th year now.
During that time, have you sponsored or co-sponsored any election-related legislation?
I believe I've sponsored at least 40 pieces of legislation relating to elections and campaign finance, and co-sponsored more than that.
And during your time in the General Assembly, have you served on any election-related committees?
I have served on elections since I was first elected and sworn in 2005, and I was on elections oversight in I believe 2013 to 2015. That's joint elections oversight.
And when you say you served on elections, is that the House Elections and Ethics Law Committee?
Yes, it's the House Elections Committee.
And are you currently on that committee?
I am on that committee.
So you've served on that committee for 16 years about?
Yes, I have.
Representative Harrison, in appearing today, are you waiving your legislative privilege?
I am waiving my privilege with respect to discussions around House Bill 1092 and Senate Bill 824, and just with respect to me, and not waiving it for any of my colleagues.
Representative Harrison, were you a member of the House of Representatives in the summer of 2018?
Yes, I was.
And you mentioned House Bill 1092. Can you describe what that bill was, if you remember?
House Bill 1092 is the legislation that that enacted the constitutional amendment that would be placed on the ballot in November of 2018 regarding voter ID.
I'd like to pull up a joint exhibit, if I could. This is JX416. Representative Harrison, can you see this document?
I can.
And have you seen it before?
I have.
Can you tell the court what it is?
This is the sort of legislative history on House Bill 1092.
And if I have this document scrolled to the bottom, to the second page, could you tell me when House Bill 1092 was filed with the General Assembly?
So it was filed on June 7th, 2018.
And could you describe for the court the timeline of House Bill 1092's consideration in the General Assembly?
So it was filed on the 7th of June, and then it was it passed first reading on June 11th, which is when it would have appeared on the calendar. And then it was at that point it was referred to the Committee on Elections and Ethics Laws, but that referral was withdrawn and re-referred to the Committee on Rules, which was interesting because elections is the committee of jurisdiction for this, but it was sent to the Committee on Rules, skipped the Elections Committee, and reported out of rules on June 21st.
And if we scroll up the document, could you continue to describe how this bill was considered by the General Assembly?
So then it was placed on the calendar for June 25th. And that was when it was considered by the House on June 25th of 2018. That several amendments were considered, and it passed second reading on the 25th. And then on the 26th, it passed third reading and was sent over by special messenger to the Senate, where it was taken up, passed first reading, referred to Senate Committee on Elections, and then reported out of the Senate Committee on Elections on the 28th. And sent to rules on the 28th, and then to the placed immediately on the calendar in the Senate on the 28th, where it passed second reading on the 28th, and then it passed third reading on the 29th. Ordered, enrolled, and ratified on that same day, came session law on 29th.
Based on your experience, your 16 plus years of experience in the General Assembly, how would you characterize the consideration of House Bill 1092?
Well, I would say that it was fairly rushed. That's a pretty short time frame for a piece of legislation with this magnitude, and perhaps not, especially in the House, not really any real public input. Rules Committee isn't where you normally receive much public input, public comment on the bill, and only one committee in the House. That was the Senate was very rushed as well.
When you say a bill of this magnitude, can you describe what you mean by that?
Well, what I mean by that is we're amending our Constitution. We're proposing to amend the Constitution, and that's a really significant change, and it's difficult to undo if you don't get it right. And this just seemed to be a fairly rushed process. And when you take it in the context that there were several constitutional amendments being considered at the same time, my opinion is, based on my experience in the legislature, was that was sort of inadequate consideration and certainly inadequate public input on this part of this effort.
You mentioned other amendments being considered at the same time. Do you remember how many other amendments were being considered at that time?
So there were 5 other amendments, 6 total, proposing to be placed on the 2018 ballot, November ballot, general election ballot.
Do you remember how many of those 6 were approved by the General Assembly to go to the voters?
The legislature approved all 6.
In your 16 years plus experience, has the General Assembly ever approved 6 constitutional amendments to be placed on the ballot at once?
No, I reviewed my notes, and it's only happened. We've only in the 16 years I've been in the legislature, we've only approved 3 previous constitutional amendments. Can't remember the exact years, but one related to waiving jury trial. I believe that was the most recent. The other was the proposed gay marriage ban. And the prior to that, there was a felony as sheriff. That you couldn't run for sheriff if you had a felony. Those were the only 3 over the course of 16 years and 3 separate election cycles.
So would you say it is a standard practice for the General Assembly to approve 6 constitutional amendments at once for the voters?
I would say that's not standard practice. Certainly not in my experience.
I'd like to now take a look at House Bill 1092 by pulling up Exhibit JX478. Representative Harrison, do you recognize this document?
I do. This is the session laws, the House Bill 1092.
And if we scroll down to the middle of this document around, do you see anywhere whether this document shows how the proposed constitutional amendment to require photo ID would be presented to the voters?
Yes, that's in section 3.
Could you read that out loud for the court, please?
So there is a line that says for and against, and constitutional amendment to require voters to provide photo identification before voting in person.
In your experience, is this language consistent with standard legislative practices for proposing constitutional amendments to voters?
Well, I would say no. It doesn't really explain what kinds of photo identification. It doesn't explain that there would need to be implementation legislation, and this is fairly vague. I mean, just compared to something that I just filed that proposed a constitutional amendment related to redistricting, and it included the implementation language so that the voters would know exactly what they're voting for. But here, the voters would have no idea, and they wouldn't know that their bank card wouldn't be accepted or the YWCA card wouldn't be accepted. It just says photo identification. So it's lacking the implementation language, which I would describe as vague.
And as far as implementing legislation, do you remember, was it known when House Bill 1092 passed the General Assembly whether this constitutional amendment would require implementing legislation?
I would say that was not widely known. I mean, we in the legislature certainly knew that, but I don't think that that was anything that was widely known by the voters.
And as far as in the legislature, were you aware of any implementing legislation drafted at the time that House Bill 1092 passed?
No, we were not. I was not, and I'm not aware that any of my colleagues were aware of any implementing legislation that was proposed.
Now, before this ballot measure went up to the voters, do you remember speaking to any voters about the proposed constitutional amendment?
Well, yes, I do. There was a fairly concerted effort to educate voters on what was going to be on the ballot. So yes, I appeared on panels, I believe, and I remember speaking to voters at the early voting site that I was working, and at the poll, same day on the election day polls I was working.
Did the lack of any implementing legislation have any impact on how you were able to talk about the constitutional amendment with voters?
Well, I would say it did, because I think that, as I said, I think that voters just thought voter ID was something that was, in their mind, what kind of ID they had with a picture on it, and I think they just didn't understand what the options were out there and what might be considered by the legislature if they voted for this amendment or against it.
Were you able to tell voters what kind of IDs would be acceptable, for example?
I was not able to explain that with any specificity, because I couldn't know what the legislation was going to look like that was going to be proposed when we were supposed to come back in later in November.
You mentioned that you have recently filed a constitutional amendment related to redistricting. Can you tell me whether that proposed constitutional amendment has any implementing legislation proposed along with it?
Well, yes, it's several pages of legislation that spells out what we anticipate to be setting up a citizens redistricting committee and how it will meet and the process it will go through, and public notice and public hearing requirements. And yes, it was pretty specific about the implementation of that particular proposed constitutional amendment.
Turning back to House Bill 1092 and this constitutional amendment for photo ID, do you remember if this passed, if the voters approved this constitutional amendment?
Yes, it was 55 to 45 statewide, different result in my county.
And do you recall any other results coming out of the 2018 election other than the approval of the constitutional amendment?
The legislature had significant changes, because in both the House and the Senate, both chambers, the Democrats came out of what we call the super minority and acquired numbers such that they could sustain a gubernatorial veto.
Turning back to the implementing legislation for this constitutional amendment, do you remember when that was introduced?
The implementing legislation, Senate Bill 824, I believe, was introduced on Tuesday, November 27th, 2018.
Is it typical in your experience for the General Assembly to introduce legislation in the November after an election?
Actually, it's not. I reviewed my notes on that, and it's only happened a couple of times since I've been in office, and one was for disaster relief. After the Matthew storm devastated our state, we needed to get appropriations out to those communities immediately, and then that turned into a session to to change the governor's powers as a result of the 2016 election. But that's, I believe that's the only time it's happened since, well, in 2004, there was a an incentives bill to provide incentives package for Dell Computer, which was considering moving to North Carolina. And there was some timeliness urgency that required the legislature to come in, but that's it prior to 2018. Just those two times.
Thank you. Do you have an understanding of why the legislature reconvened in November of 2018?
Well, this came up, if I recall correctly, during the debate on 1092 and the proposed adjournment resolution that has adjourning in June and coming back after the election in November. The speculation was that the legislature anticipated losing its supermajority leadership, and they would hope to pass implementing legislation while they could still override a governor's veto.
Representative Harrison, when did you first see an initial draft of the implementing legislation for this constitutional amendment?
Sorry. So I need to correct my affidavit, paragraph 13, and I apologize for that. I was conflating the 2 weeks, the week of consideration of the when the Senate first took it up and then when the House took it up. So the Rules Chair's office, David Lewis's office, sent out the draft of David Lewis's proposed draft of proposed voter ID implementation legislation on late Tuesday afternoon, the 20th. That was a Tuesday before Thanksgiving, and that was sent out to House members of the House Elections Committee and members of the Joint Elections Oversight. So those individuals had a draft of that on Tuesday afternoon before Thanksgiving. So I misspoke in my affidavit, and I apologize.
And when you reference your affidavit, is that the affidavit filed in support of preliminary injunction in this matter?
That is.
How would you characterize the timing of receiving a draft the Tuesday before Thanksgiving?
Well, I would say that many of my colleagues and I were involved with family and Thanksgiving vacation together, and so it wasn't an ideal time to review the draft for sure.
Did you attend any committee meetings discussing this draft implementing legislation before it was filed?
So when the notice went out with the proposed legislation on the 20th, there was also a notice for the joint elections, House and Senate Joint Elections Committee that would be meeting on Monday the 26th. That would be the Monday after Thanksgiving. And House Elections Committee members were invited. And at that time I was on the House Elections Committee, so I attended. So I did come back to Raleigh early to attend that meeting on the 26th. To participate in that meeting that was going to both consider the legislation and hear from several. Here, I think we heard from the community colleges and the UNC system, and then also the Board of Elections at that committee as well.
I'd like to pull up a joint exhibit. This is JX878. If we could scroll to the second page. Representative Harrison, do you recognize this document?
I do. It's this is the presentation that Director Strack gave to the Joint Elections Committee on their efforts to implement the previous voter identification requirement from the 2013 legislation.
And when you say Director Strack, can you just clarify what she was the director of at that time?
I apologize. The State Board of Elections Executive Director, Kim Strack.
I'd like to direct the court's attention to PDF page 31 of this exhibit, JX878. Representative Harrison, could you please read this slide?
So, and this is in the review of the 2016 primary data, and so it says that 1,048 voters completed a declaration of reasonable impediment, indicating that they had a reasonable impediment preventing them from obtaining acceptable identification. And of these reasonable impediment voters, 864 ultimately counted.
What was your understanding of this information as far as whether any reasonable impediment voters were not counted?
Well, it looks like a significant portion. It's more than 10%, so it's 146. No, I'm sorry, 86. Yeah. So anyway, a significant portion of the voters who attempted to file the reasonable impediment document was rejected.
I'm not going to quiz you on the math to do math in your head, but it's fair to say there were some voters using a reasonable impediment whose votes did not count.
Yes, I'd say it's over 10%, so it's a significant portion.
Did Executive Director Strack, in presenting this information, ever suggest that any of those voters whose votes did not count were committing voter fraud?
She did not.
Did Executive Strack ever suggest any of these voters were actually ineligible to vote?
She did not.
I'd like to move to the next page after this. This is PDF page 32 of Exhibit JX878. Could you read this slide out loud for the court, please?
Sure. So this is the continued review of the 2016 data. So 1,248 voters did not present acceptable photo identification or execute the declaration of reasonable impediment or return to the county office by deadline after election night. These votes did not count. And 2.7 million voters participated in the 2016 primary. It doesn't reflect the numbers of folks who did not stay in line or who just left the line without trying to do either of these.
For those 1,248 voters whose votes did not count, do you remember if Director Strack ever suggested those voters were committing voter fraud?
She did not.
Did she ever suggest that any of these voters were ineligible to vote?
She did not.
Thank you. We can take this slide down. Representative Harrison, during this November 26, 2018 meeting, do you remember if the Joint Elections Oversight Committee was given any updated data regarding voter ID possession rates?
No, I do not.
Do you remember if in this meeting, the Joint Elections Oversight Committee was given any updated analysis on the impact that the proposed implementing legislation for photo ID would have on African-American voters?
No, I do not. I do not think we received that information.
What about any similar analysis for any other voters of color?
Same recollection. I do not believe we saw any information related to that at that meeting.
You mentioned earlier the implementing legislation was filed as Senate Bill 824, and I'd like to talk about the consideration of Senate Bill 824 with the General Assembly. Can you describe how you recall, how you would characterize the General Assembly's consideration of Senate Bill 824 after it was filed?
Well, I know when I spoke on the House floor during the floor debate, I talked about it being a rushed process. I think there are a lot of us who felt like there was inadequate public comment, that many of us felt we shouldn't be taking it up in November, that we should be waiting till January because there was no, and while the voters had voted for this constitutional amendment, there was no requirement that it be implemented immediately and that there might be more thoughtful consideration. And all this was happening between Thanksgiving and Christmas when people had obligations and distractions, and not a good time to be implementing legislation related to such an important issue.
Do you remember if the House Elections Committee ever discussed Senate Bill 824 after it was filed?
So if I recall correctly, the House Elections Committee considered the legislation on December 3rd, and that carried over to, because I believe it was going late into the day on the 3rd, and it carried over into Tuesday the 4th of December, if I recall correctly.
Let's take those meetings in turn. I'd like to ask you about the December 3rd meeting. Do you remember generally what happened during this meeting?
Well, we had a discussion of the bill, and I believe we had proposed amendments that we wanted to consider, and there was some thought that they may be taking public comment that day, and I believe folks had come into town to do that, but mostly it was a discussion of the legislation, if I recall correctly.
Do you remember if you spoke at this meeting?
Well, I do recall speaking at this meeting.
I'd like to pull up an exhibit. This is a transcript of the meeting, JX774. And I'd like to direct your attention to, this is PDF page 6, but it's the transcript page 17. You could scroll in there. I'd like to direct your attention to line 14, Representative Harrison. Do you recall, could you read line 14 through 16 for the court?
Sure. So I posed a question, just a question for the chair. Are we planning to hear any public comment in this committee meeting?
And did you get a response to that
And
question?
the chair, I'm sorry. And the chair said not at the current time, but we can after we have committee discussion.
Why did you inquire about whether there would be public comment?
Well, I feel like public comment on this particular issue was very important. There were a lot of strong opinions. The joint committee that had met the week before had a limit of 30 slots, and it seemed like there was more interest in commenting than was available at that time. And the House, I was hoping that the House would hear from the public as we consider this bill as normal practice.
Do you remember if there was any public comment allowed at this December 3rd meeting?
If I recall correctly, there was not at the December 3rd meeting. I believe they may have allowed a few to speak on the 4th, the next day.
I'd like to go to another page within this transcript. This is PDF page 9, and it's the transcript page 29. If I could direct your attention to line 11. Representative Harrison, am I correct that line 11 reflects comments that you were making at that time?
Yes.
And could you read out loud for the court lines 11 to 15?
Yes, and this was directed at the bill manager, Representative Lewis, and I said, asked him, do you have any concept of how many registered voters do not have any of these IDs that are listed here that might be impacted? I mean, I've seen a figure of about 200,000, but I'm not sure. Do you know what that figure is?
Do you recall why you asked this question?
Well, I was concerned that the IDs that had been identified to comply with the voter ID requirement might leave out a lot of voters, and the numbers I had seen were in the several 100,000, and that's a significant of voters who might be disenfranchised because they did not have the ID, and that's why I wanted to know, and we didn't have any updated information presented to us, so that's why I asked the bill sponsor that.
Do you remember what the bill sponsor replied as an answer to your question, if any?
I believe he said that he had seen the same numbers that I had, and that he didn't know. He said he'd be making a misstatement if he tried to estimate the numbers of people who still live in a state that don't have an ID.
Thank you. We can take this document down. In this December 3rd meeting, do you remember the House Elections Committee being given any updated data regarding voter ID possession rates?
I do not believe that we were given that any updated data.
And during this meeting, do you remember the House Elections Committee being given any updated analysis on what impact, if any, the proposed bill would have on African American voters?
I do not believe we were given that data, that updated estimate. No.
What about any such analysis for other voters of color?
No, I do not believe we were given any updated analysis of other voters of color.
You mentioned that this meeting, the House Election Committee meeting, continued to December 4th. Can you tell me what happened in the December 4th meeting?
My recollection on the December 4th meeting, and again, I believe it was because we were going so late on that December 3rd meeting, was that we heard amendments. We considered amendments, and then we heard from a few who had come to speak, a few from the public who had come to give comment on the bill.
Do you remember if you spoke at this meeting, Representative Harrison?
I'm fairly certain I offered an opinion on, first of all, I offered some amendments, if I recall correctly, and I'm fairly certain I offered an opinion about the legislation.
I'd like to pull up the transcript of this meeting. This is Joint Exhibit 776. And I'd like to direct your attention to PDF page 27 of this exhibit. And this is Transcript page 98. And starting at line 16, Representative Harrison, is it fair to say this is the beginning of the comments you were just referring to?
Yes, it is.
Could you read out loud for the court what you said starting at line 16? And I'll ask Ashley to kindly continue with the transcript, pages 99 as needed.
And I appreciate the larger print. Thank you. Started by thanking Chair Jones. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I wanted to thank Chair Lewis and the rest of the committee for working with us as we tried to improve this bill. And I'm looking forward to further improvements, perhaps on the House floor tomorrow. I don't think it can go without saying that I remember pretty vividly the 2013 debate on voter ID and the panel of voters that we had, and those that were extremely low income, and the burden it placed on them to take a day off work when they're working a minimum wage job and didn't have their own transportation. If they had access to public transportation, going and getting the birth certificate they would need to get the ID that they would need for this was happening in other states. So I don't think that we can ignore that this is going to put a burden on some in our society. The figures, I know that people dispute them, and we raised it yesterday, and there's something like 200,000 North Carolinians that did not have this ID. And it's not easy if you don't have the extra income, if you're holding down a job or two, and you don't have transportation to actually access these IDs. So I don't think that we should ignore that this will be a burden on people. I think it may be a particular problem for the displaced community, and hopefully it will continue to try and accommodate them as we debate amendments on the floor tomorrow. I believe that I said disability, and it was transcribed as displaced in line 19. Do you want me to continue?
Yes, please. And
Okay.
I'll ask Ashley to put up page 100 as we continue through the transcript.
Okay. So I think the provisional ballots are going to be extraordinarily time consuming on the voters and on the elections judges and precinct workers, and on enormous expense on the counties that we actually, I don't think, are doing anything about right now. At least my county directors think we've got the funding in there for them to bring this up to speed for this budget year. It's already been budgeted, and they have no money for implementing this. So I appreciate the fact that folks think there might be a problem out here. I continue to look at the documentation. I'm looking at a sheet of paper now where we've got since 2031 credible allegations of voter impersonation, which is actually what this idea is about, is voter impersonation out of 1 billion ballots cast. In North Carolina specifically, 4.7 million voters, and one case of voter impersonation, and that was the woman who went to vote for her mother who had died before the election. So, maybe it's somewhere in the middle that folks who think that voter fraud is a huge problem, and a lot of us who think that it's not really a problem. But what we're talking about is taking away taking away people's right to vote. And I think that's a big problem. So I really hope, and I appreciate the committee working, and I appreciate Chair Lewis working with us to make this as fair as we can make it. So I just want to thank you.
Do you remember your motivation for making these comments?
Well, I do. I was around for the House Bill 589, the 2013 voter ID legislation, and I recall those weeks of hearings, and I recall the folks who had testified about the burdens that this would place on certain portions of our society. And I was aware of the statistics out there about so little voter in-person impersonation fraud that we were getting ready to enact a voter ID requirement that would leave out hundreds of thousands of North Carolina voters, disproportionately minority, disproportionately disability, disproportionately elderly, disproportionately students. And I didn't think it was right. And I felt very strongly about that. And we were called out on it back in by the Fourth Circuit and on the 589 bill. And I just felt like we have a history in our legislature on this issue, and we needed to get it right. And I didn't feel like we were getting it right.
You mentioned again the 200,000 about North Carolinians that wouldn't have an ID. Can you tell me, during this meeting, was the House Elections Committee given any updated data regarding voter ID possession rates?
We were not.
And was the House Elections Committee in this meeting given any updated analysis on the impact this proposed bill would have on African American voters?
We were not.
What about any analysis on other voters of color?
We were not.
Do you remember if the committee took a vote at the end of this meeting on the bill?
I believe we did. I mean, yes, we did.
And do you remember how you voted?
Well, I voted no.
And do you remember what the vote was on? What kind of vote the committee had before it?
Well, I believe it was. I believe that the vote went along party lines to advance this legislation to its next stop.
And sorry, you probably just answered this. Do you remember how you voted?
Yeah, I voted no.
And why
Consistently
did you,
no.
why did you?
I voted no because I felt like well, there were a couple of reasons why I voted no. Although I didn't really articulate it in the committee, I articulated it on the floor that I felt that I voted no on the process, the rush process, but also on the substance. I just felt like we could have done a better job on of including more IDs that would be acceptable, easier. I mean, removing some of the burdens on, I believe, the provisional ballots, and allowing folks to vote a regular ballot. There were a myriad of amendments that we had offered that were denied, and I felt like the legislation could have been a lot better and more inclusive of voters who might potentially be disenfranchised.
We can take this document down, and I'd like to bring up another document. This is Joint Exhibit 476. Representative Harrison, do you recognize this document?
Sure. So this is the legislative history on Senate Bill 824, which was the implementation of the voter ID constitutional amendment legislation.
And if we scroll down in this document, around right there. This is the first page at the bottom. Yeah, if we continue to scroll down. Can you tell me what happened to this bill after that vote we talked about in the House Committee on Elections?
So it went to rules after elections on the 4th and was reported out of rules that day and calendared for consideration on the next day on the 5th.
And can you tell me what happened on December 5th, 2018 with this bill?
Sure. So on December 5th was when the full House considered the implementation legislation, House Senate Bill 824, and we had a number of amendments that were considered, and some that weren't, and voted out, if I recall, that day after a couple of hours of debate and amendment consideration.
We scroll up on the exhibit to the first page. When you say it was voted out, are there any entries that you can specifically describe on this document that indicate that it came out of the House?
So it was it passed second and third reading on the 5th. I can go into that as well. And then ordered and gross sent to the Senate, where I believe they had to have a concurrence vote because there were some changes made in the House. So it was placed on the calendar for the 6th for the Senate to consider, and so the Senate approved the bill, concurred with the House changes, and so it was ordered, enrolled, and ratified, and sent to the governor on the 6th. He vetoed it 8 days later. Our rules require that, I think, when we're in session, that he has 10 days to veto a bill, if I remember correctly. So he vetoed it on the 14th, and then the veto override vote happened first in the Senate because it was a Senate bill. So that was placed on the calendar for the consideration for the 18th of December, veto overridden on the 18th, and then sent over to the House on the 18th and placed on the calendar for the 19th when the House overrode the governor's veto, and it became Sessions law later that day on the 19th.
Turning back to the December 5th, thank you. Turning back to the December 5th, you mentioned that the House considered amendments and then the bill passed its second and third readings in the same day. And I think you said in a span of a couple of hours. In your experience, was this enough time for a bill like Senate Bill 824 to do all of those things in the same day?
I do not think so. I raised this issue on the House floor that it seemed like a rush process, and as I said earlier, it wasn't clear that we should be even doing this in the 2 weeks after weeks between Thanksgiving and Christmas, after the voters had voted, when we were going to have a brand new legislature in January. So I don't think that we felt like it should have been as rushed a process as it was, because we should have taken more time to have the data that we would know who would be disenfranchised. We should have taken more time to get public input, and none of that happened, but it went through this fairly rushed process of the committee meetings and then on the floor. And then I recall objecting to third reading because we knew that there were amendments. We had an agreement with Representative Lewis to run some amendments on third reading, and then my objection to third reading was ignored, and so normally it would have gone over to another day so that we could consider more amendments, but that didn't happen. And I would say that's not the regular course of business of the legislature.
Do you know why your objection to the third reading was denied?
I don't know why I was denied it, except to perhaps rush the process. We had, as I said, we had an agreement with Representative Lewis to try and work on a couple of amendments that would be considered on third reading, and that opportunity was not availed because we did not have third reading. Those amendments ended up being considered in a technical corrections bill that came up later, but that was It's not usually how it works.
So did Democratic members, were they given the opportunity to propose all of the amendments they had intended to during the House floor debate?
I would say not, because we had, and this happens sometimes, when you have an amendment for a bill and the staff can't get it prepared in time, or it's an issue that might just come up during the debate, you would object to third reading, and then you'd have a overnight to get your amendment prepared and propose the next day. And so that's why it was important to not ignore the objection to third reading, and particularly on this bill where we had an arrangement.
In your opinion, do you think your objection to the third reading was properly lodged?
It's my opinion it was. I weighed in pretty quickly, but the speaker overruled me, and so he just called for third reading immediately, and so we did not have our third reading that day. I mean, we did have our third reading that day. We did not have it the next day.
You mentioned that some amendments were considered by the House earlier, before that objection that you mentioned. Do you remember what kind of amendments were proposed?
Well, there were a number that were proposed. I mean, I guess you could see the list. And it looks like 13. Some ruled out of order, and some failed. But the Democrats had organized what we considered ameliorative amendments. That included an amendment relating to allowing one to use one's high school ID. That was Representative Fisher. Representative Bobby Richardson had offered an amendment on public assistance IDs. Representative Marsha Mori had offered an amendment on early voting to allow flexibility and require that early voting sites be open the most popular day of early voting, which traditionally in North Carolina, which is the last Saturday before Election Day. And there were others as well.
Do you remember what happened to that early voting related amendment?
So that early voting amendment was ruled out of order, and I believe it was ruled out of order. And the reason why that was important was because the early voting sites were going to be places where folks could get an ID on site at the early voting sites, and we just felt it was very important that Saturday, which was I think 136,000 in the 2018 election, voters had voted on that last Saturday, and if I'm remembering that number correctly, and that is the most populated early voting day and traditionally in North Carolina, and we felt like a lot of voters would be able to get access to the voter ID if they were required to be open on that last Saturday. And so that was ruled out of order. If I recall, I'm looking forward on the calendar. I mean, on this history.
Do you remember if you proposed any amendments, either during the floor debate or in committee?
I did. I proposed several amendments in committee and on the floor, some of which were accepted, some weren't. There was one relating to natural disasters that had become a big issue during Matthew and then exacerbated by Florence. But there were disasters that were deemed state, but not federal, and the language was too restrictive. So we added some flexibility to language related to that. I had requested that we found that in the 2016 election experience primary with the voter ID, that the reasonable impediment was considered inconsistently throughout the state, and in particular in Mecklenburg County, the poll workers there were not accepting class schedule as a reasonable impediment. So I asked that that be listed specifically in the list of reasonable impediments, because work schedule was included, but not class schedule. I had offered an amendment relating to the use of temporary DMV. If you go to the driver, if you go to renew your license and you get your temporary ID until the hard copy comes in, and I wanted to make sure folks would be able to use that. I'd also requested an amendment related to making sure that if any challenge would have to be a unanimous ruling by the three poll workers or precinct judges. I
I'd like
believe
to
those
talk
were.
about, thank you. I'd like to talk about some of those amendments in turn. Let's start with the last one you mentioned, that the precinct judges unanimously agreed. Do you remember what happened with that amendment?
After much discussion, I believe that amendment passed.
And what about the amendment that you mentioned with regard to student school schedule being considered a reasonable impediment?
So that amendment that amendment ended up being in the offered in the technical corrections. Since we didn't have third reading, if I recall correctly, that amendment was offered in the technical corrections, which is a separate bill, House Bill 469, I think. That amendment passed the House, but on the conference on the amount without any explanation.
So is your understanding that the amendment to include student school schedule as a reasonable impediment did not become a final part of the law?
It did not.
Are you aware of an amendment proposed by Representative Jackson related to allowing voters to satisfy the ID requirement with 2 witnesses?
I do. Representative Jackson offered that in committee, if I recall correctly, and but that ended up coming out maybe the next day on the House floor in an amendment offered by Representative Lewis.
And coming back to this floor debate, December 5th, at any point during that floor debate, do you remember the House receiving any updated data on ID possession rates?
I do not remember. I do not believe we were.
And do you remember the House receiving any updated analysis on how, if at all, this law might have a disparate impact on African American voters?
I don't believe we were.
And any such analysis for voters of color?
I do not believe we were.
Do you remember during this House floor debate if you made any comments?
I did. I did make some comments. I believe I spoke to the process and the substance of the legislation.
What do you mean by process of the legislation?
Well, I believe I pointed out that I felt like the process was rushed, and I didn't think it was necessary to be so rushed. And I can't remember if I mentioned it at the time, but I was certainly thinking about the fact that we're going to have a much more differently composed legislature starting in January, and so that's what when I was speaking to the process.
I'd like to pull up the transcript of this floor debate. This is Exhibit JX 777. And I'd like to direct your attention to PDF page 31. And this is page 116 of the transcript itself. I'd like to direct your attention to line 20. And am I correct, Representative Harrison, that line 20 reflects comments that you started making?
It did.
I'll ask you just to read a bit of this, starting at line 20 and continuing on to page 117.
Sure. So I did want to start by thanking Chairman Lewis because I think he's done a really terrific job working with us to help improve the bill. And this bill is a much better bill than the bill that left this chamber in 2013. So I want to thank him for that. But I did want to speak both to the process and to the substance. And on the process, just because I'm hearing a lot from my constituents about the process. One, the constitutional amendment itself was somewhat vague in terms of how the constitutional voter ID amendment would be implemented. So I do believe there were a lot of voters who did not actually know what they were voting for. And while it did pass 55% to 45%, 45% of North Carolinians felt pretty strongly that it was not a good amendment. So I did want to speak to that. And also, while I appreciate the efforts to allow for public comment, I think there were a lot who felt like they did not get a chance to speak at some of the committee hearings, especially last Mondays, when those 30 slots filled up pretty fast. And I did want to speak to the timing too. Yes, the voters spoke, but there was no timeline listed in the constitutional amendment. We'd have plenty of time to spend a little bit more time on this and get more public input if we.
And let's continue to page 118.
If we had taken this up in the January session. So I wanted to speak to that specific point, but back to the substance. I sort of disagree that there is a voter ID problem. I've seen the statistics. I saw that statistic that out of the 4.8 million votes cast in 2016, in North Carolina, there was one case of voter impersonation. And that was a woman who voted for her mother who had passed away going to vote for Trump. And the other study that I alluded to yesterday in committee, that out of 1 billion votes cast since from 2000 to 2014, there were 31 instances of potential voter fraud, and not all of those were voter impersonation, and not all of those were prosecuted. So we're talking about a very small problem. And just a reminder, I believe it's a felony to commit voter fraud, so I don't think people are anxious to make themselves vulnerable for a conviction. I think the problem is the implementation, and that's where the devil is in the details. And while it's broader in this bill, then that's before us. I think
We'll continue to page 119, please.
there are a lot of folks that are going to be disenfranchised. And we know there are a couple 100,000 North Carolinians who do not currently have an ID. I think this would disproportionately affect folks of color, the young, the elderly, and those of low income. And I know families myself where no one in the family has an ID. They don't have jobs, they don't have a car, they don't have access to public transportation. And I think these kinds of folks are going to find it very difficult to get the ID necessary to vote. And I think the problem, well, there have been some accommodations made, such as reasonable impediment. The way that it was implemented in the 2016 primary, there were a number of voters whose provisional ballots were not counted. Some had to go through the process of filing for reasonable impediment, and it seemed to be somewhat arbitrarily interpreted depending on what county you lived in. So you've got that problem, whether someone considers the reasonable impediment legitimate enough or not to get access to provisional.
We'll continue to page 120.
Provisional ballot. I think that's going to be a problem. We saw some examples. The numbers I saw, there were something like 1,400 or 1,000 reasonable impediment ballots that were cast. More than a quarter of those were rejected, and those votes did not count. And I think the problem is that we're looking at 1,000 plus North Carolinians whose votes were not counted in the 2016 primary. And we're looking at a much larger implementation here and the potentiality for thousands of North Carolinians' votes not to count. And this will impact election results.
We can stop there.
Okay.
Thank you. I recognize that your comments may have continued, but we'll stop there.
Okay.
Can you tell the court what was your motivation for making those comments?
Well, I felt our history in North Carolina, demonstrated that maybe we weren't ready to quickly implement a voter ID requirement that wasn't broad and accommodating and flexible for those who might find difficulty getting the IDs or access to the ballot box. So I just felt like I felt like, as I said, I felt like on the process that we rushed it, that we didn't have any requirement to enact this legislation prior to us coming back in January, where we could have gotten more input. We could have considered the data that might have led us to think about alternatives. And I just felt like the voter ID problem is that there is very little, if any, in-person voter impersonation. The most recent figure I saw was 7 since 2015, between 2015 and 2020, and that's from the State Board of Elections. So we're getting ready to implement a restrictive requirement on voting to solve a problem that doesn't exist. And at the same time, a lot of folks are going to lose their constitutional right to vote. And to me, that was very troubling.
Looking at the process overall in the General Assembly for Senate Bill 824, would you consider that process a bipartisan process?
I don't see how you could call that process bipartisan at all. I just, well, there might have been a few votes. I've participated in bipartisan legislation, and this is not what it looks like.
We went over your comments, and I believe in the December 4th committee meeting, and then again in the December 5th. You thanked the chairman. Doesn't that indicate it was a bipartisan process if you were thanking the chair?
I would say no. Chairman Lewis was always one of the kindest and most gracious legislators to work with, and I had always appreciated his willingness to listen to my concerns about any piece of legislation. And I would say it's just a matter of decorum. We're in the minority. We don't have a lot of influence. All we can do is help make problematic legislation less problematic or improve bills. And I had just genuinely appreciated his listening to our concerns. And but you know, I think he was pretty clear that he can make stuff get past its caucus. And I think that I just think it's a matter of sort of decorum in the chamber to thank a bill sponsor or a bill manager for working with you to help improve a bill. And that's that does not make a bill bipartisan. Bipartisan legislation is legislation where both parties work across the aisle actively together from the get-go to craft legislation for the betterment of our state. And this was a very partisan effort, and voter and elections legislation is rarely bipartisan, but on the voter identification, just given the history of our state on this issue, you just can't consider it bipartisan.
You also testified that one of your amendments related to precinct judges unanimously agreeing if an ID does not comply. You mentioned that passed. Doesn't the fact that at least one of your amendments that you suggested for this bill passed make this a bipartisan process?
No. I mean, often as I said, so you're in the minority. Mostly what you can do is try and make problematic bills less problematic and try and improve. But that just because an amendment gets passed, it doesn't make it bipartisan. And if you look at the vote count, no. And actually, on that particular amendment, it actually just moved the law back to where it was after House Bill 589 passed. That was something that was in that legislation, and it just got put back in the statute. So no, just because an amendment gets passed in a chamber, it does not make a bill bipartisan.
Do you remember if any Democrats voted in favor of Senate Bill 824 passing its third reading?
So if I remember correctly, it was Representative Goodman and Representative Hall. So I think there were two on third reading.
Doesn't the fact that 2 Democrats voted in favor of the third reading make the bill a bipartisan bill?
I would say not. For a couple of reasons. One, I think that Representative Goodman, who represented a very conservative district, felt like he had to carry out the wishes of his constituents, and I believe that's the statement he made. And Representative Hall just had a somewhat fraught experience with his party affiliation during the last months of his term, and so I can't get into his head about why he voted no, but I have an idea. I mean, why he voted yes, but I have an idea.
We can take this exhibit down. Now, with the court's permission, I'd like to place a demonstrative. This is marked demonstrative marked PDX. My apologies, I'm looking just to confirm exactly what we marked this demonstrative. PD 1-14. This has been disclosed to legislative defendants and the state defendants. Representative Harrison, have you seen this demonstrative before?
I have.
And what does it describe?
This is the overlap between legislators who voted for House Bill 589 on concurrence, and then voted on the veto override on Senate Bill 824.
And have you had a chance to confirm whether this accurately reflects your understanding of that overlap?
I have. Yes, I have. I looked at the vote counts for those two votes, and it does.
And how many members of the General Assembly voted for both House Bill 589 and Senate Bill 824?
So it's 62 out of both chambers voted for both 589 and 824.
Do you remember about how many members of the House are overlapping?
I think it's about 40, 43, 45. I'm 43.
And how many members of the House are there at any given time?
So there are 120.
And if we look at the House concurrent aye votes, can you give the breakdown of Republicans and Democrats that were voting for House Bill 589, that concurrence vote in the House?
So 77 Republicans voted for. I'm sorry, 73, because I believe there must have been excused absences. 73 of the 77 Republicans voted for concurrence on 589, and 0 Democrats on 589 concurrence.
And what about in 2018 for Senate Bill 824, the House veto override?
So on the override, it was 71 of 75 Republicans and 1 of 45 Democrats. I believe Representative Goodman did not vote to override the governor, but Representative Hall did.
So can you tell me, if there are 120 members of the House at any given time, and most Republicans, and 73 out of 77 Republicans are voting for House Bill 589, and 71 out of 75 Republicans voting for Senate Bill 824, why would the overlap between those two only be about, as you said, 43?
Oh, there's there've been retirements, deaths, moved to the other chamber, running for higher office. So it's not the exact, the makeup's not exact, but I would say it's a fairly significant overlap of members who are there in for the 2013 and 2018 votes. But there are a lot of retirements and folks who've left the chamber for whatever reason.
Thank you, Representative Harrison. I have no further questions at this time for the witness. I'll tender the witness over.
All right, Mr. Masterson, you may cross-examine the witness.
Thank you, Your Honor, and good morning, Representative Harrison. Can you hear me okay?
I can, thank you. Hello.
Great. My name is Joe Masterman, and it's nice to meet you. I also am going to have some questions for you from the legislative defendants. So, as you said on direct, you were in the General Assembly when the voter ID amendment was put on the 2018 ballot. Is that correct?
I was.
And you did not support that amendment, correct?
I did not support that amendment, correct.
Is it fair to say that you've never been a supporter of voter ID laws?
I would say that's fair.
You were also on the ballot on 2018, correct?
I was on the ballot, yes.
And you campaigned against the voter ID amendment, is that correct?
I did. I sort of focused on my own race, but I did participate in yes, communicating with voters my dislike of the constitutional amendment, proposed constitutional amendment.
And you would have encouraged them to vote against the amendment, is that correct?
I would have actually all 6.
All 6 minutes. And you did encourage voters to vote against the voter ID amendment, correct?
I did.
But as you said, the amendment was eventually adopted.
Yes, it was.
And now that the amendment has passed, would you agree that it is important for the General Assembly to comply with the North Carolina Constitution by passing a voter ID law?
I do. I just think the timing wasn't. But the constitutional amendment didn't require that it be done immediately. Yes, but the constitutional amendment did require that we enact this legislation, implementing legislation.
The voters have spoken, correct?
Yes.
You've been a member of the Democratic Party for the entire time that you've been serving in the House, is that right?
Yes, I have.
And as I believe you said, the Democratic Party was in the super minority when Senate Bill 824 was under consideration.
Yes.
You were involved in helping organize the Democratic caucus on the House's consideration of Senate Bill 824, correct?
I was.
I think you called a meeting of your caucus members who were interested on Senate Bill 824. That would have been the week of December 3rd, 2018. Is that correct?
Yes, I actually believe it was the December 3rd. Yes, the day of.
And your hope at that meeting was to find ways to improve the bill so that everyone who deserved access to the polls had access to the polls. That was your ultimate goal, correct?
Yes, sir.
And were there any changes to Senate Bill 824 that you thought would have served that goal that members of the House Democratic Caucus did not attempt to offer at any point in the consideration of Senate Bill 824?
I mean, in hindsight, we probably would have pushed for more aggressive online voter registration and our other things. But I think at the time, I think we were offering what we thought might help the most. But it was such a short period of time. We probably didn't think of all the possibilities of what would have made that a good bill, a better bill.
And just to clarify my question, there were none that you had in mind at that time that you withheld from the process, or any member of your caucus did?
No, right. That's correct. We didn't, not that I recall.
And you've served, I believe you said, on the House Elections Committee since 2005. Is that right?
That's correct. Yes.
You were not on the Joint Legislative Elections Oversight Committee when Senate Bill 824 was under consideration, correct?
I was not. Yes, correct.
And I believe you said on your direct examination that a draft of Senate Bill 824 was circulated on November 20. So that would have been circulated to you as a member of the Elections Committee, correct?
That is correct.
Do you recall when that draft bill was made publicly available?
And I thought it was the night before the November 26th Joint Elections Committee hearing, but I might be mistaken.
Would you have known when, back in 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago, would you have known when the bill was publicly released?
We normally would know when a bill is publicly released. I'm just, I'm drawing a blank on it right now.
Okay. I'd like to see if this refreshes your recollection. Ms. Hardiman, could we pull up what's been marked as LX051? And this is a report from WRAL entitled Republicans Roll Out Voter ID Bill. You're familiar with WRAL, correct?
Sure, yes.
And do you see the date on this article?
Yeah, so that is the same day, November 20th, that I guess it was released to the committee members. November 20th, yes.
Does this refresh your recollection about when it would have been released publicly?
Yes, it does. And yes,
So
November 20th.
November 20th. Okay, thank you. Ms. Hardiman, you can take that down. Now, if we could look at what's been marked as JX0771. And if Ms. Hardiman, and this, I'm showing you a transcript of the November 26th Joint Elections Oversight Committee. That's the committee hearing that you said you attended, correct?
Yes.
Do you remember speaking at that committee hearing?
I do recall, well, I believe I recall offering some suggestions towards the end of that committee meeting, if I'm correct, because yes, I believe I spoke at that committee.
Ms. Hardiman, could we turn to transcript page 70? And just give us a moment here, Representative.
Oh, sure.
And you see your name there beginning on line 8?
I do.
Okay. And you say, thank you, Mr. Chair, just to follow up on the process. And continuing, you pose this question. You anticipate filing bills tomorrow in the House and the Senate. Will it go through the regular committee process, and we'll have an elections committee to discuss this bill when it comes up in the House? And Chairman Lewis answered, yes, ma'am, correct?
Yes.
And as I believe you've described today, that is what happened, correct?
Yes.
So before the bill reached the House floor, I believe it went through the House Elections Committee and the House Rules Committee.
It did.
And as you discussed, amendments were proposed and debated, and some were adopted in those committees, correct?
They were.
Do you recall how many amendments the whole House voted on?
I remember seeing a figure of 20 or 24, but I can't remember specifically. Oh,
And-
the whole House. No, the whole House, you mean on the 5th, I would say. I believe I saw Amendment 13, so I believe that might have been the number on the 5th.
And Ms. Hardiman, you can take this exhibit down, thanks. And yeah, so it went up to 813. I won't make you look back at that chart, but if I represent to you that one of those was withdrawn, that would be 12 amendments voted on the floor, right?
Right.
Do you recall how many of those amendments were accepted?
I can't remember the number off the top of my head. I'm sorry.
But you proposed an amendment, right?
I did.
And that was the disaster amendment that was accepted, correct?
Yes.
Do you recall how many amendments were proposed by Democratic representatives?
On the House floor, I can't remember specifically the number. I'm sorry.
Okay. Did you vote for every amendment proposed by a Democratic representative?
I believe I did.
So is it safe to say that you thought those amendments would have improved the bill?
Yes, I do believe so.
Do you recall how many of those amendments were accepted?
I mean, I remember a Beasley amendment, remember a Floyd amendment. There was my amendment. I can't recall exactly how many there were accepted on that vote. I'm sorry.
Does 4 sound about right to you?
I guess that would be.
Republicans held a supermajority in the House at this time, correct?
That is correct.
So no amendment could have passed without Republican votes, correct?
That is correct.
The Republican supermajority could have enacted Senate Bill 824 without accepting any amendments proposed by Democrats, correct?
They could have, yes.
The Republican supermajority could also have accepted every amendment proposed by Republicans, correct?
They could have.
Do you recall whether the House accepted every amendment proposed by a Republican?
I do recall Representative Lewis speaking against at least maybe a few of the Republican proposed amendments during the floor debate. I recall that, yes. So they did not accept all of the Republican amendments. Yes, that's correct.
Did you vote? Do you recall voting for any amendments proposed by a Republican member?
I may have. I think Representative Lewis may have recommended a technical amendment. There might have been others that seemed to improve the bill that I might have voted for, but I'm sorry, I can't recall exactly.
Okay. And the General Assembly as a whole had a Republican supermajority at the time, correct?
That is correct, in the House and the Senate, yes.
So the General Assembly could have passed Senate Bill 824 without a Democratic primary sponsor, correct?
It could have, yes.
And it could have passed Senate Bill 824 without receiving any votes from Democrats, correct?
Well, it could have, yes.
I would like to show you what's been marked as JX0622. This is one of the House amendments that failed. And this is Amendment A13, which I believe you mentioned a moment ago. You would have read this amendment when it was proposed on the House floor, correct?
Yes, I would have.
Does this look like an accurate copy?
It does. I can't see the amendment except for the fact that it moves. Yeah, there we go. Okay. Yes.
And you can see at the top here that it was proposed by Representative Richardson, who is a Democrat, I believe.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Yes.
And you saw at the top there that the amendment had failed, correct?
Yes.
And it's typical with legislation that not every amendment that is offered gets accepted, correct?
That is true.
Yeah. Would you say that's standard?
Yes, it is. It is standard.
Is it your understanding that this amendment would have added public assistance IDs to the list of IDs that qualify for voting use?
Yes, that was the purpose of that amendment. Yes.
Would you have voted for Senate Bill 824 if this amendment had been adopted?
I wouldn't have voted if only this amendment had been adopted. There was a lot more improvements that need to be made to this bill. I think it would have helped improve the bill, but it wouldn't have caused me to vote for the bill.
The General Assembly has passed a law after Senate Bill 824 that now allows voters to present an identification card issued by a department, agency, or entity of the U.S. government or of this state for a government program of public assistance, correct?
Yes, and House Bill 1169. Yeah.
Are there any forms of ID that would have been allowed by what we're looking at, House Amendment A13, that are not allowed by House Bill 1169?
No.
Let me stop you right there if I can, please. It's now 11 o'clock, time for our morning break. We're going to take about a 15-minute recess at this point. We'll come back at 11:15. Thank you.